From a $400 drone hunting down an $8 million tank to a fiberglass speedboat sinking a warship worth more than some small country's entire GDP, to a shoulder-fired rocket from the 1960s knocking modern helicopters clean out of the sky. This is why the most expensive militaries ever assembled keep losing to the cheapest weapons on the battlefield. And stick around, because by the end of this you'll understand the one number the Pentagon really does not want you doing the math on. Some of these weapons cost less than a used car. A few cost less than a month's rent. And every single one of them has humiliated a machine that took a decade and billions of dollars to design. The kind of machine that shows up on recruitment posters and defense budget hearings, not in a junkyard, which is exactly where several of them ended up. Let's start with the most expensive babysitting job in modern military history. Since late 2023, the United States has parked some of its most advanced warships, Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, each one worth roughly $2.5 billion, in the Red Sea, protecting global shipping from a group most people couldn't find on a map, the Houthis, a militia operating out of one of the poorest countries on Earth. Their weapon of choice is a drone that costs somewhere between $2,000 and $20,000, built from parts you could probably order off the internet in an afternoon. The Navy's answer is a standard missile interceptor, SM-2S, SM-6S, sometimes SM-3S, running anywhere from $2 to nearly $30 million a shot, depending on the variant. Between the fall of 2023 and early 2025, the Navy fired over 200 of these interceptors, burning through close to $1 billion just to keep cheap drones from reaching the ships. One widely repeated comparison put it bluntly: a $2 million missile fired to stop a $2,000 drone. And this isn't a one-time embarrassment. It's been happening on an almost daily basis for over a year, which means the bill keeps climbing every single week the Houthis keep launching. Senior defense officials have openly called the arrangement unsustainable. There's a wrinkle analysts like to bring up here. Those missile costs don't even include the destroyer itself, the crew, the fuel, or the strike group escorting it. The real price tag of every single intercept is closer to hundreds of millions once you count the whole operation standing behind that one missile launch. But flip it around and the logic still holds. A $2.5 billion ship and the sailors aboard it are worth vastly more than any missile fired to protect them, no matter how lopsided the math looks on a spreadsheet. Translation: the Navy is winning every single engagement and still somehow losing the argument. 5 stars for the missile crews, 0 stars for whoever's doing the accounting back in Washington. In February 2026, the United States and Israel launched a massive strike campaign against Iran. Iran's answer wasn't to fight back ship for ship, jet for jet. It couldn't. Instead, it turned to the cheapest tool in its arsenal, the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil trade sails through every single day. Iran didn't need its navy for this. It used small speedboats, drones, and a stockpile believed to number in the thousands of naval mines, some costing barely a few $1,000s apiece, to threaten a choke point the global economy simply cannot route around. Just the threat of mines, not even a confirmed large-scale minefield, just the possibility, was enough to send oil prices spiking toward $120 a barrel and tack 50 cents onto a gallon of gas in the United States within a week. It used small speedboats, drones, and a stockpile believed to number in the thousands of naval mines, some costing barely a few $1,000s apiece, to threaten a choke point the global economy simply cannot route around. Just the threat of mines, not even a confirmed large-scale minefield, just the possibility, was enough to send oil prices spiking toward $120 a barrel and tack 50 cents onto a gallon of gas in the United States within a week. The U.S. response involved airstrikes, a full naval blockade of Iranian ports, and burning through Patriot interceptor stockpiles at a rate defense officials described as unsustainable, the exact same word used about the Houthis, for the exact same reason. At one point, Iran reportedly started charging ships over $1 million each just to guarantee safe passage through waters that used to be free. One analysis called it exactly what it was: the cheapest option available to Iran, deployed against an opponent that had already spent a fortune degrading everything else in its arsenal. A country that had just had its air force and navy gutted in weeks still managed to rattle the global price of oil using boats that cost less than a used pickup truck. And notice what Iran didn't need to do any of this. It didn't need a single functioning warship, a single fighter jet, or a single working air defense battery. It just needed geography, a stockpile of cheap mines, and the willingness to use them, which is a genuinely uncomfortable thing to realize about a choke point that a fifth of the planet's oil depends on. Sticking with the same region for a second, because if firing a $4 million missile at a $2,000 drone sounds bad, wait until you hear what those same cheap machines have been doing to actual American aircraft. The MQ-9 Reaper is a $30 million hunter-killer drone, one of the most capable unmanned aircraft ever built, packed with sensors, satellite links, and precision weapons. And yet, low-cost Iranian-designed drones and surface-to-air systems have reportedly brought several of them down over Yemen and the wider Gulf region, 7 by some counts, plus more lost during the 2026 fighting. 7 plus $30 million machines, engineered by one of the wealthiest defense industries in human history, taken out by weapons a tiny fraction of their price and sophistication. Each loss also meant losing weeks of collected intelligence and a gap in coverage that had to be filled by some other equally expensive asset, so the real cost of each downed Reaper stretches well past its sticker price. It's the equivalent of losing a championship chess match to somebody who's never played anything more complicated than checkers, and somehow they still find a way to flip your king. What makes it sting even more is that the Reaper was never designed to fight anything like this. It was built to hunt lightly armed insurgents in open desert, loitering for hours at a time, completely unbothered. Nobody designed it to survive a swarm of disposable drones and improvised air defenses. And that mismatch, a weapon built for one kind of war, suddenly dropped into a completely different one, is a theme you're going to see over and over again on this list. A first-person view drone, the exact same kind hobbyists use for racing through obstacle courses, costs roughly $400 to build. A Russian T-90M, one of Moscow's most modern production tanks, runs upward of $4.5 million. An American-supplied M1 Abrams costs somewhere between $8 and $10 million. And these $400 drones have been finding them, diving through open hatches, punching through the thin armor on turret roofs, and ending them for good. Of the U.S. supplied Abrams tanks Ukraine has lost in combat, the overwhelming majority were killed by drones, not by other tanks, not by artillery, drones. Open-source trackers following the war have documented well over 3,000 Russian tanks destroyed, damaged, or captured, representing tens of billions of dollars in steel turned into scrap metal by something that fits inside a backpack. Do the math on that exchange rate, and a $400 drone with even a modest chance of connecting still comes out as one of the most cost-effective weapons ever fielded in the history of warfare, even accounting for every drone that misses, gets jammed, or crashes into a hedge on the way there. Ukrainian production numbers back this up in a way that should worry every defense planner watching. Tens of thousands of these things are being assembled every single month in garages, workshops, and volunteer centers by people who picked up a soldering iron for the first time less than a year earlier. Crews have started welding cages and mesh screens onto their own tanks just to give incoming drones something to detonate against before they reach the armor, a field improvisation that looks almost medieval bolted onto a modern battle tank. Somebody give that garage workshop engineer a corner office. Some of these drones are now guided by cheap AI targeting systems that lock onto a shape once a human operator points at it, meaning the $400 price tag is already buying something closer to a precision-guided munition than a toy, a gap that's only going to keep closing. Ukraine doesn't really have a navy, not in any traditional sense. What it has is a growing fleet of unmanned explosive speedboats, models like the Magura and the Sea Baby, each one costing somewhere between $200,000 and $300,000, less than the price of a single modern torpedo. Sent against a Russian Black Sea fleet that hadn't lost a major surface engagement in decades and was, on paper, one of the most powerful naval forces in the region. Since 2022, these drone boats have sunk or crippled roughly a third of that fleet, landing ships, patrol vessels, missile carriers worth hundreds of millions of dollars apiece, and in one particularly brutal case, An underwater version of the same drone helped cripple a Caliber missile-carrying submarine estimated to be worth somewhere around $400 million. The result? A navy that was supposed to dominate the entire Black Sea was quietly pushed out of its own home port in Crimea and forced to relocate hundreds of miles away to Novorossiysk just to keep its remaining ships safe. The Russians are no longer rulers of the Black Sea, one Ukrainian security official said afterward. Grain ships that had been stuck in port for over a year, too afraid to risk the crossing, started moving again once it became clear Russia's navy couldn't guarantee control of its own coastline anymore. Not a bad outcome for a country whose navy, on paper, barely exists. And the psychological effect didn't stay contained to the Black Sea either. Navies elsewhere started openly studying the footage, because a fleet that size getting bullied out of its own coastline by boats that cost less than a house is exactly the kind of lesson no admiral wants to learn the hard way, in an actual war of their own. Just weeks into the full-scale invasion, in April 2022, Ukraine fired 2 of its own domestically built Neptune missiles, a weapon whose entire development program reportedly cost around $40 million total, at the Moskva, the flagship cruiser of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, a vessel valued at roughly $750 million. The Moskva carried enough air defense missiles to protect an entire Russian battle group in southern Ukraine. 2 missiles later, it was sinking. The ship that was supposed to be shielding everything else in the region couldn't shield itself. Naval analysts still cite it as one of the starkest lessons of the entire war. With the right guidance system and a bit of nerve, you don't need a navy to sink a flagship. You need 2 missiles and a target that never saw it coming. And the psychological ripple went well beyond that one ship. Other Russian vessels in the region reportedly started keeping far greater distance from the Ukrainian coastline almost immediately afterward, months before the drone boats even existed in serious numbers. Proof that the fear this created spread a lot faster than the technology itself did. Take the improvised explosive device, or IED. In Iraq and Afghanistan, insurgents built roadside bombs for a few $100s using old artillery shells, agricultural fertilizer, and something as simple as a garage door opener or a cell phone as the trigger. The American response was the MRAP, a V-hulled armored vehicle purpose-built to survive blasts, costing anywhere from $500,000 to over $1 million per unit, on top of billions more spent on route clearance units, bomb disposal teams, and jamming equipment to block remote detonators. Entire convoys were reorganized, entire patrol routes rewritten, entire specialties within the military created, all in response to a device that any determined person with a shovel and some spare parts could rebuild the very next day. And IEDs still became the single leading cause of American and coalition casualties in both wars. Not tanks, not gunfights. A bomb buried in dirt by someone who'd never set foot in a military academy. The most technologically dominant fighting force in human history, and its deadliest enemy for 2 decades running, was assembled on a kitchen table. The RPG-7 is a Soviet-era rocket launcher that costs a few $100s, weighs about as much as a bag of groceries, and takes almost no training to fire accurately at close range. In Mogadishu in 1993, Somali militia fighters used RPGs to shoot down 2 U.S. Black Hawk helicopters, multi-million-dollar aircraft representing the absolute cutting edge of American aviation engineering at the time, triggering the 18-hour firefight that became known as the Battle of Mogadishu, later immortalized in Black Hawk Down. 3 decades later, the same weapon is still in active service in conflicts around the world, virtually unchanged in design. A rocket launcher that predates the internet, the smartphone, and GPS navigation can still ground a machine built with satellite-guided precision. It doesn't need a computer, a battery pack, or a software update. Just a trigger pull and a bit of nerve at close range. Somebody should really tell the RPG it's not supposed to still be relevant. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan with total air superiority. Attack helicopters, fighter jets, the works, against fighters who had almost nothing to shoot back with. Then the United States began quietly supplying Afghan Mujahideen fighters with FIM-92 Stinger missiles, shoulder-launched, portable, costing in the tens of thousands of dollars, fired at Soviet aircraft worth many millions each. Historical estimates suggest hundreds of Soviet aircraft were downed over the course of the war, and Soviet pilots reportedly grew afraid to fly low-altitude support missions at all, pulling gunships back to safer, less effective altitudes. Ground troops who'd relied on close air support to survive firefights suddenly found that support arriving late or not at all. A superpower's entire air campaign functionally restrained by a weapon light enough for one soldier to carry alone on foot. Many historians still list the Stinger as one of the decisive factors that turned the war, and some argue it played a real role in accelerating the eventual Soviet withdrawal. Not a bad resume line for something you can sling over your shoulder and carry up a mountainside on foot. In October 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, 50 Israeli tanks charged a line of dug-in Egyptian infantry near the Suez Canal. Those infantrymen were carrying a T-3 Sagar missiles, man-portable, wire-guided anti-tank weapons that cost a tiny fraction of the tank rolling toward them. By the time the smoke cleared, 40 of those 50 tanks had been knocked out. Across the whole war, Israel lost hundreds of tanks in total, and while historians later argued about exactly what percentage the Sagars accounted for, the psychological damage was already done. Military commentators around the world spent the following years seriously debating whether the tank itself, the centerpiece of every modern army since World War II, was now obsolete. It wasn't, but the fact that the question was even being asked seriously in defense ministries around the world tells you everything about how badly a few $1,000s worth of guided missiles had just embarrassed one of the most feared armored forces on the planet. In the summer of 2006, Hezbollah fighters in southern Lebanon faced off against Israel's Merkava tanks, widely regarded as among the best protected main battle tanks on the planet, engineered from the ground up around keeping their crews alive, partly in direct response to what had happened in 1973. Hezbollah's answer was a stockpile of Russian and Iranian-supplied anti-tank guided missiles, each one costing a small fraction of what a single Merkava was worth. Over the course of that short, brutal war, dozens of Merkavas were struck, and a notable number were destroyed outright, a genuine dent in Israel's confidence in heavy armor that triggered years of doctrine reviews afterward. It forced military planners around the world to quietly reconsider a question they thought had been settled decades earlier. Is there such a thing as enough armor when the missile chasing you is designed specifically to punch through whatever the last generation of armor was built to stop? Some Merkava crews reportedly started welding extra slat armor onto their own tanks in the field, in a scramble that echoed almost exactly what Ukrainian tank crews would be doing nearly 2 decades later against a completely different cheap weapon. Turns out most heavily armored tank on Earth and invincible were never actually the same sentence, and this was the second time that exact country had to learn it the hard way. In May 1982, during the Falklands War, an Argentine jet fired a single French-made Exocet missile, a weapon that cost a small fraction of the ship it was aimed at the British destroyer HMS Sheffield. The missile's warhead didn't even fully detonate. It didn't need to. Leftover rocket fuel ignited on impact, started an uncontrollable fire, and 6 days later the Sheffield sank while under tow, becoming the first Royal Navy warship lost to enemy fire since the Second World War. Argentina had only a handful of these missiles in its entire arsenal, some estimates put it at 5, and yet the mere threat of the remaining ones reportedly reshaped how the entire British task force operated for the rest of the war, forcing warships to alter their formations and rethink where the fleet's most valuable ships, its aircraft carriers, were allowed to sail. One functioning missile, fired from one aging jet, cost a global superpower a modern warship and put the fear of a single weapon type into an entire navy for the rest of the conflict. Through the 2000s and into the 2010s, Somali pirates, armed with little more than fiberglass skiffs, aluminum ladders, and a combination of AK-47s and RPGs worth maybe a few $100s total, began hijacking massive commercial cargo ships and oil tankers worth tens of millions of dollars apiece, forcing international navies from more than a dozen countries to spend billions of dollars patrolling the Gulf of Aden in response. At the peak of the crisis, ransom payments to pirate networks reportedly totaled hundreds of millions of dollars across the years the crisis ran. A handful of guys in an open boat with essentially no formal training brought global shipping insurers and some of the most powerful navies on Earth to their knees. Shipping companies started rerouting entire trade lanes around the Cape of Good Hope instead of the Suez Canal just to avoid the risk, adding weeks to journeys and driving up costs for everyone everywhere, all because of some ladders and a few rifles. Somewhere out there, an actuary from that era still has nightmares, because the pattern isn't new. The Sagar in '73, the Exocet in '82, the RPG in Mogadishu in '93, the Stinger in the '80s, the IED in the 2000s, the Skiff in that same decade, Hezbollah's missiles in 2006, and now the FPV drone, the Sea Drone, and a whole country's worth of mines and speedboats in the Gulf, all in the 2020s. Every era gets its own version of this shock, and every time the expensive side assumes it's a fluke, it never is. So here's the full tally. A $30 million drone, downed by something 1,000 times cheaper. A $400 drone that might be the most cost-effective weapon ever fielded. A navy pushed out of its own home port by boats cheaper than a torpedo, and its flagship sunk by 2 missiles that cost a fraction of what it took to build. An entire country rattling the global price of oil with mines and speedboats. 2 Black Hawks grounded by a rocket older than the engineers who built them. Hundreds of Soviet aircraft kept out of the sky by something one soldier could carry. 2 generations of the world's best armored tanks punched open by missiles a fraction of their price, 33 years apart. 1 destroyer sunk by a single missile that barely even detonated. And a few guys in fishing boats who made global shipping flinch for a decade. The exchange rate is almost never dollars for dollars. It's a few hundred or a few thousand against a few million, decade after decade, with no coordination between any of these groups. They all landed on the same idea independently. And every one of these weapons is easier to build today than 5 years ago. So if $400 can already do this, what happens when the next version costs $40? If you made it this far, drop in the comments which one shocked you most, the Reapers, the Moskva, or the Pirates, and follow the channel for more deep dives like this one.